The Grayson family lived in a quiet Oregon suburb, nestled among trimmed lawns, maple trees, and the kind of peace that made it easy to believe nothing bad ever happened there. Melissa Grayson, 50, was the heart of the household and art teacher. Known for her calm voice and gentle nature, she hosted weekend painting classes in the sunroom, baked for local fundraisers, and smiled at everyone who passed her on the street. Her husband, Richard, was less visible but equally respected. A real estate agent with a calm demeanor and clean reputation, he was the kind of man who never raised his voice or stirred trouble. Their only child, Luke, had just returned home. After college, unsure of his path, but still holding on to the safety of his childhood home. At first glance, their family life looked ideal. Melissa would prepare dinner while Richard caught up on emails, and Luke often helped her set the table, laughing at old stories. Neighbors called them polite, well-adjusted, even enviable. No one could sense what was really happening inside. But beneath the polite greetings and garden parties, something quiet and disturbing had started to bloom. Luke's return hadn't just been about career confusion. It had been about something deeper. A need he didn't fully understand, a pull he couldn't name. Luke had always been close to his mother, especially after Melissa quit her full-time teaching job years ago and focused more on freelance projects and time at home. Their bond had grown intense, slowly but steadily, and when Luke moved back, it became something else entirely. Richard was usually out late, attending open houses or client dinners, and Melissa and Luke were left alone for hours. It started with harmless activities, cleaning the attic, organizing photo albums, working on art together in the studio. But the energy between them shifted. Their physical closeness became habitual. Their conversations drifted into more emotional territory. Luke confided things he wouldn't tell anyone else. Melissa listened, flattered by the attention and comforted by his presence. The transformation was gradual but undeniable. Melissa began dressing differently, often wearing makeup and clothes she hadn't touched in years. She spent longer in front of the mirror, bought perfume she hadn't worn in a decade. Luke noticed. And instead of finding it strange, he found it captivating. She wasn't just his mother anymore. She was the only person who seemed to understand his aimlessness, his frustration, his isolation. Their talks became longer, more personal. Physical boundaries began to dissolve. A touch on the arm lasted too long. A look lingered. Nights extended as they sat together on the couch, music playing, the lights dim. There were no screams, no violence, no chaos, just a creeping darkness neither of them could stop, or perhaps didn't want to stop. It was easy to ignore the line they were crossing when they kept the house quiet and the curtains drawn. Richard never noticed anything, or if he did, he didn't say it. He had grown emotionally distant over the years, absorbed in work, perhaps, choosing ignorance over confrontation. As time passed, Luke stopped looking for jobs. He rarely left the house. Melissa seemed fine with that. She encouraged his stay, defended his choices, supported his laziness as if it were part of a bigger plan. Richard, though, began to grow suspicious. It started with small things. Melissa's phone always on silent, Luke and Melissa exchanging glances that felt a little too familiar, too knowing. Once, he overheard them whispering late at night and felt an unease he couldn't explain. He tried brushing it off, tried to believe it was just his imagination. But something had changed in the house. Neighbors started noticing too. Melissa and Luke were seen together more than Melissa and Richard. They ran errands alone, took walks around the neighborhood, even went on a weekend trip under the excuse of visiting an art show. Richard didn't go. He wasn't invited. People started whispering, but no one wanted to believe the worst. This was a respectable family. Nothing like that could happen here. Still, there was something off in their smiles, something a little too rehearsed. Melissa's laugh came more easily around Luke than Richard. Luke seemed overly protective of his mother, watching her closely. stepping in whenever Richard spoke with the slightest tone of criticism. It was becoming harder to ignore the cracks in their perfect image. Behind closed doors, the atmosphere had grown thick with tension and secrets. The bond between mother and son was no longer innocent. It had become obsessive, possessive, and entirely unnatural. And though no one on the outside could prove anything, something was clearly wrong. What looked like love was beginning to twist into something far more dangerous. Something that could not stay hidden forever. Asterisk, it wasn't one moment that changed everything between Melissa and Luke. It was a slow erosion of boundaries that happened so quietly, neither of them saw it coming. The line between love and obsession, between care and desire, blurred under the weight of their emotional dependence. When Luke had returned home, he had been vulnerable, jobless, confused, and searching for a purpose. Melissa had welcomed him with open arms, eager to feel needed again, and in doing so, she gave him the attention and affection he craved. Melissa had never fully recovered from the emotional distance in her marriage. Richard was functional, but detached, more interested in work than in her inner world. Years of quiet dinners, unspoken frustrations, and cold silences had left her numb. When Luke came back, she felt seen again. She wasn't just a wife or a mother, she became the center of someone's universe. Luke noticed everything about her, the way she styled her hair, the small details in her paintings, the softness in her voice when she laughed. She had forgotten what it felt like to be admired. That admiration became addictive. Luke, for his part, began to confuse emotional closeness with intimacy. He found comfort in Melissa's presence, warmth in her touch, and safety in her approval. With no career prospects and no friends nearby, his world shrank to the walls of their home and the woman who occupied it. What started as innocent connection became dependency. He began avoiding his old college friends, ignoring calls, and declining interviews. Melissa didn't push him to change, she encouraged his presence. Their time together became routine. Sacred even, a part of life neither wanted to interrupt. They shared private jokes, watched old movies late into the night, and often fell asleep on the same couch. There were glances that lasted too long, silences that spoke more than words. Luke started buying her gifts, necklaces, scarves, scented candles. He said it was to thank her for everything, but the gifts became more personal, more romantic. Melissa didn't stop him. She accepted them with a soft smile, her heart fluttering in ways she hadn't felt in years. It became easier to isolate themselves. Melissa no longer invited Richard to join their activities. She avoided eye contact with him during meals. Their marriage had become a shadow, a dull and dying bond that neither tried to save. The intimacy that should have existed between husband and wife now lived elsewhere, covert, distorted, and dangerously growing. By the end of summer, the relationship between Melissa and Luke had fully shifted into the unthinkable. Neither of them spoke of it out loud, but their actions spoke volumes. They became secretive, paranoid, constantly watching the clock to avoid Richard's return. Their connection had crossed into forbidden territory, and instead of stopping, they built their lives around it. They convinced themselves it was different, special, that no one else would understand. Melissa justified it by clinging to the belief that love couldn't be wrong if it felt this powerful. Luke, emotionally immature and confused, accepted it because it was the only source of validation he had. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional possession. They needed each other in a way that made them blind to consequences. But secrets, especially one so unnatural, can never remain buried. The strain began to show in small ways. Melissa grew jumpy, always checking her phone, flinching when Richard spoke too loudly. Luke became aggressive in subtle ways, jealous if Melissa spent time with anyone else, suspicious of Richard's every move. Their hidden world had become a pressure cooker, and it was only a matter of time before it exploded. One afternoon, Richard came home early and found Melissa and Luke sitting too close on the back porch. Nothing inappropriate happened in that moment, but the tension was unmistakable. The silence when Richard approached, the quick shift in body language, the uncomfortable pause before Melissa said hello. Richard felt it, even if he didn't yet know what it meant. That night, he began searching through Melissa's phone. It was locked. He tried Luke's laptop, also locked. He started to see the small cracks as something more than coincidence. Why had Luke stopped applying for jobs? Why was Melissa dressing differently, acting differently, pulling away from him entirely? The puzzle pieces didn't yet fit, but the picture was starting to form. Luke sensed the suspicion. Melissa grew nervous. Their secret had become too big to hide, and paranoia began to take over. They whispered more, avoided Richard, and made new plans. Vague discussions about leaving, about starting fresh somewhere else. They talked about love like it was a reason to disappear, not realizing how close they were to tragedy. The night it all collapsed was colder than usual for November. Rain fell steadily, tapping against the windows of the Grayson house like a warning no one heard in time. The evening started in silence. Richard came home earlier than expected, having canceled a dinner meeting at the last minute. He walked through the front door to find Melissa in the kitchen, startled by his presence. Luke wasn't there. Melissa mumbled something about him going to the store, but her hands shook as she chopped vegetables. Richard noticed but said nothing. He retreated to the living room, trying to suppress the rising tension that had plagued him for weeks. The unspoken distance between him and his wife had deepened. Melissa avoided his gaze, kept conversations short, and barely touched him anymore. And Luke, his only son, acted like a stranger, cold, withdrawn, and always lingering too close to his mother. Richard had spent the last few nights lying awake, trying to make sense of what was happening in his own home. Now it felt like the truth was just out of reach, and something terrible was about to reveal itself. By 9 p.m., Luke returned, drenched from the rain, his clothes clinging to him. He greeted Richard with forced politeness, then went straight to his room. Melissa followed him minutes later. Richard, now alert and suspicious, quietly made his way upstairs and stood outside Luke's door. He could hear muffled voices. Nothing clear, just a tone of urgency, as if secrets were being scrambled together in panic. He walked away without making a sound, but the storm inside him had begun. Around 10:30, the power flickered. Richard went into the garage to check the fuse box. It was routine, something he had done many times before. What wasn't routine was what happened next. Somewhere between opening the garage door and stepping inside, he never made it out. At 10:42 p.m., the neighbors heard a scream, sharp and short, like a burst of agony cut off too soon. By the time the police arrived, the scene was soaked in horror. Richard Grayson was found lying on the cold concrete floor of the garage, face down in a pool of blood. He had been stabbed multiple times with a palette knife, the same kind Melissa used for her painting. The wounds were deep, erratic, fueled by rage rather than precision. Blood spattered the walls, the shelves, even the inside of the car door. It was a brutal, frenzied attack, and the killer had left no sign of forced entry. Melissa was found sitting on the living room floor, her hands trembling, clothes stained. Luke stood nearby, stiff and pale, staring at the officers like they didn't quite exist. He claimed he had just found his father's body. He didn't explain the blood on his shoes or why his phone had been wiped of recent activity. The initial report mentioned no broken locks, no stolen property, no signs of an intruder. It was clear the killer knew the layout of the house. The knife had been taken from Melissa's art room, not the kitchen, which suggested forethought rather than a spontaneous act. The story that Luke and Melissa gave was fragmented. They said Richard had gone to the garage alone, that they had heard a noise, that they had panicked. But the inconsistencies in their timelines, the missing phone data, And their cold detachment told a different story. As investigators combed through the house, they noticed something strange. Melissa's studio had been recently clean scrubbed, wiped, organized in a way that didn't match the rest of the house. In the trash, they found a pair of gloves, soaked in water but still marked with faint traces of blood. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's front porch showed Luke leaving the house around 8:45 p.m., wearing the same hoodie he had on when the police arrived, but he had claimed not to have gone out. The detectives began focusing on motive. Why would a wife and son murder their husband and father? At first glance, the family seemed to have no financial issues, no legal trouble, no enemies. But the deeper they dug, the more twisted the picture became. Text messages retrieved from cloud backups revealed cryptic conversations between Melissa and Luke, phrases like, "We can't go back now," and "He's the only thing in the way." Search history from Luke's laptop showed disturbing queries: how to destroy evidence, how long blood lasts on concrete, and most damning of all, how to make a murder look like an accident. The community was shocked. A brutal murder inside a respected home with no clear answers. People whispered theories. Some thought it was mental illness. Others believed Richard had uncovered something he was never meant to see. The idea that a son could be involved in his father's death was horrifying enough, but what truly haunted the town was the quiet presence of Melissa, whose distant gaze and empty voice seemed to mask something far more sinister. The evidence was stacking up, but no one yet understood the full truth, that this wasn't just a murder. It was the final blow in a twisted story of obsession, secrecy, and the destruction of every boundary that once defined right and wrong. Asterisk. The investigation quickly escalated from routine to extraordinary as more pieces of the puzzle emerged. What initially looked like a domestic tragedy soon unraveled into something darker, something deeply disturbing that no one on the outside could have imagined. The detectives assigned to the case sensed from the start that the official story Melissa and Luke gave didn't add up. Their reactions were too calm, too synchronized. Their behavior didn't match the horror of what had taken place just feet away from where they were found. The crime scene was processed carefully. Blood patterns indicated a struggle, but there were no defensive wounds on Richard. It was as if he had been taken by complete surprise. The wounds suggested a sudden ambush, likely from someone he knew and trusted. Melissa had a bruise on her left wrist that she couldn't explain. Luke had a scratch on his neck he claimed was from the dog. But the dog had been locked outside that night. According to security footage, forensics teams scoured the house, finding subtle but damning evidence. There was a second pair of latex gloves hidden in a bathroom cabinet, both with trace amounts of blood and fibers from Richard's clothing. The murder weapon, the palette knife, had been hastily washed but not thoroughly cleaned. Beneath the sink, they found a stained cloth tucked behind the garbage bin, its presence suspicious in a household usually kept obsessively clean by Melissa. Digital evidence painted an even more chilling picture. Cloud backups revealed dozens of deleted texts between Melissa and Luke. While most were vague, some messages hinted at resentment toward Richard. One message from Melissa read, "He's making it harder every day. I can't breathe when he's in the house." Another from Luke said, "We'll never be free unless something changes. You know what I mean." More troubling was a set of photos investigators uncovered. Stored in a hidden folder on Luke's phone were selfies taken with Melissa, photos that went far beyond what could be interpreted as mother and son affection. They were intimate, emotional, and undeniable in their implications. Detectives brought in a forensic psychologist to assess the mental state of both suspects. The resulting report revealed an unhealthy emotional entanglement that bordered on obsession. Melissa had developed a psychological dependency on Luke, feeding on his attention and idolization. Luke, in turn, had attached himself to his mother as the only figure who offered him purpose and unconditional acceptance. Interview transcripts exposed the fractured dynamic. Under pressure, Melissa began to unravel. She broke into tears during her second interview, contradicting her previous statements. She admitted that her marriage had been lifeless for years, that she and Richard barely spoke anymore. When asked about her relationship with Luke, she deflected, saying they were simply very close. But the tone shifted when investigators presented her with the photos. Her silence lasted nearly a full minute. Then she simply said, "It wasn't supposed to go this far." Luke, on the other hand, remained stoic. He repeated the same statements, denied involvement, and claimed that his father had enemies from work. But his internet history, including articles about how to stage a break-in and how to clean up after a violent crime, said otherwise. The evidence was overwhelming, and the pressure was mounting. Eventually, Melissa confessed, not with a scream or an outburst, but in a soft, exhausted voice. She described the night in pieces, how Richard had become suspicious, how she and Luke talked about what might happen if he found out. There was no concrete plan, she said. Just a conversation that turned into an impulse. According to her, it was Luke who acted first. He followed Richard into the garage, and when Melissa heard the sound of the struggle, she didn't stop him. She watched it happen, frozen, as the life was taken from her husband. The confession shocked even the most experienced officers. It wasn't just a murder, it was a collapse of all moral structure. A mother and son, consumed by secrecy and dependence, had destroyed the one person who stood between them and their delusion of freedom. The psychology of the case fascinated and horrified experts alike. It wasn't about money or revenge. It was about control, obsession, and the breakdown of boundaries that should never be crossed. When the news hit the media, the public reaction was immediate and intense. Headlines screamed of incest, murder, and betrayal. The Grayson family name, once spoken with admiration, was now drenched in scandal. The house on Rosehill Lane was cordoned off, a crime scene sealed in yellow tape. As cameras lined the street and neighbors stood in disbelief, but the damage had already been done. The truth was out, and the family was no longer a family. The portrait of perfection had been torn apart, revealing something monstrous underneath. And as Melissa and Luke were formally charged, it became clear that this wasn't just a crime. It was a complete and irreversible collapse of humanity behind closed doors. Asterisk. The trial of Melissa and Luke Grayson drew nationwide attention. Courtrooms filled with journalists, true crime enthusiasts, and locals who once saw the Graysons as the epitome of quiet respectability. Now they were watching the dissection of a nightmare. Every detail of the case, from the twisted relationship between mother and son to the brutal murder of Richard Grayson, was laid bare under the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. No camera could fully capture the discomfort in the room. When the prosecution opened with the photographs found on Luke's phone, images that left no doubt about the nature of the relationship between the two defendants, the evidence was overwhelming. But the emotional weight of the case was heavier than anyone anticipated. The prosecution painted a portrait of a family consumed by secrecy and psychological dysfunction. Melissa, once a beloved art teacher and community member, had become the symbol of betrayal and depravity. Luke, who once walked across a stage to accept his college diploma with proud parents in the audience, now sat shackled beside his mother, refusing to look anyone in the eye. Witnesses testified about the changing dynamic in the Grayson household, how Melissa and Luke had become inseparable, how Richard seemed like a ghost in his own home, and how the entire neighborhood felt something was deeply off in the months leading up to the murder. Expert witnesses were called in to explain what many struggled to comprehend. A forensic psychologist testified that the relationship between Melissa and Luke was rooted in emotional dependency and shared delusion. A psychological entanglement where both parties lost the ability to distinguish right from wrong. The expert described how boundaries had slowly dissolved, How years of neglect and isolation had laid the groundwork for a codependent, obsessive bond that ultimately turned deadly. Melissa's defense team attempted to shift blame to her mental state. They argued that she had been emotionally manipulated by Luke, that her fractured marriage and years of loneliness made her vulnerable to confusion and poor judgment. But the jury was unmoved. Her own journal entries, recovered during the investigation, revealed not only awareness of the relationship's wrongness, but also a disturbing acceptance of it. She had written of wanting to be free, of dreaming about a life where only she and Luke existed. Those words sealed her fate. Luke's defense was similarly weak. His legal team portrayed him as emotionally stunted and mentally unstable, a young man led astray by an older, manipulative figure. But text messages, search histories, and video evidence showed clear premeditation. He had researched methods of cleaning crime scenes and staging break-ins. He had purchased gloves and bleach days before the murder. Despite attempts to frame him as a confused victim of maternal control, the prosecution made it clear Luke was an active participant. Jury deliberated for less than a day. Melissa Grayson was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Luke Grayson was convicted of second-degree murder and received a 25-year sentence. When the verdict was read, Melissa lowered her head and wept silently. Luke didn't move. There was no outburst, no reaction, just an empty stare forward, as though he had already accepted his fate long before the gavel struck. After the trial, the Grayson house was put up for sale but remained vacant. No one wanted to live in a place where such a tragedy had unfolded. The neighborhood, once warm and close-knit, became quieter, more withdrawn. Families spoke in hushed tones when passing the house. Children crossed the street to avoid it. The golden retriever that had once walked alongside the Graysons was adopted by a neighbor and seen less and less in public. The story of the Grayson family became modern urban legend, a chilling tale told in whispers and featured on podcasts and television specials. But for those who had known them personally, it wasn't just a story. It was a wound that refused to heal. The fall from grace had been too steep, the crime too grotesque, and the betrayal too deep to forget. Melissa and Luke remained incarcerated, their communication restricted, their connection legally severed. But the damage they caused couldn't be contained by prison walls. Their choices had rippled through the lives of everyone around them, leaving behind only pain and questions that could never be fully answered. In the end, there were no winners. Just a man murdered in silence, a family destroyed by its own secrets, and a community left to grapple with the horrifying reality that sometimes the darkest monsters are the ones you think you know best. Asterisk.